And then we'll create another query through query design. This one we'll use patient and visit tables and resize the field list as needed. And for this query, we're going to look for older patients who had the flu, who visited us because of the flu. And we're going to first add first name and then last name and then their birth date and their phone number and city. And then from the visit table, the date they visited and the reason. And to pull out just the older patients, we're going to look at their birth date, and we want those who have a birth date that was on or before the last day of 1970. So we'll say less than or equal to. There's no spaces in here, but a less than followed by an equal sign, and then 12/31/1970. So that's a criteria that says we want the birth date to occur on or before December 31st, 1970. And then I'll press tab, see the pound signs that come in. I'll keep tabbing to the reason field. Oops, one too many. And then in the reason field, we want to add the word influenza. Be sure you spell that right. Now I'm adding it on the same row as the birth date criteria is. And so when you have multiple criteria like this on the same row, that's called an AND combination. And so it's going to match records that have the birth date that matches this condition and has a reason that matches this condition. So we will run this query, and it found 2 patients that have a matching birth date and also came to the clinic for influenza. We are going to save this query and call it older and flu patients. And then close it. And then we're going to do something similar. So we're going to, again, copy this older and flu patients query. So we'll copy, we'll paste it in an empty spot of the navigation pane and give it a name of older or flu patients. And it puts it over in the navigation pane. So now I'll open up older or flu patients and switch to design view. And for this query, we want to use an or condition. So we don't want both of these criteria on the same row. We want them on different rows. Notice that the row under criteria says or, and each of these additional rows have an implied or. So you can have multiple criteria specified on separate rows. So I'm going to delete influenza from that row, arrow down to the or row, and type influenza. And then what's going to happen when we run this query is it's going to match all records that have a birth date before this date or have come to see us for influenza, regardless of their birth date. But before we run this, let's add one more thing to the birth date field. We're going to click in the sort row and choose to sort by descending. That's so we can better see the results once it's run. And then we'll run the query, and we can see everything that it pulled sorted by date of birth. So we can see the first 4 records have dates of birth that are past 1970, but the reason they are included in the results is because they came to see us for influenza. So it matched the influenza part of the criteria. All of the rest of these records that it pulled up have a birth date that's prior to 1970. And so that's why they are included, regardless of whether they came to see us for influenza or not. So that's the result of the or condition. And we're going to make just a few more changes to this data sheet, though, in terms of appearance. First, we're going to change the font, make it a little bigger. So on the home ribbon, we'll come over towards the right, not used to not where we're used to seeing it. But over on the far right, we're going to change the font size to 14. It affected the whole data sheet. We're also select the entire data sheet by clicking the data sheet selector and double click on any column border to make all the columns their best fit. And then we can just click in that first name column to deselect everything. And then finally, we're going to add some alternating row colors. And so over in your text formatting area on the right, there's an alternative row color button. And we can choose what color we want every other row to be. And we're going to choose in the theme colors in the green column, we're going to find green accent 6, lighter 60%. And click it, and it made every other row green. So a little easier to differentiate the records. Then let's save that and close that query. 2 more queries to make, both dealing with money. So first we'll go to the Create ribbon and choose Query Design, add Visit and Billing tables, and then resize as needed. And from these tables, we will add the visit ID, the patient ID, the visit date, and then from billing, we'll add the invoice item and invoice paid and invoice amount in that order. Then under invoice paid, we're going to add a criteria that just says the word no. So I'll start typing an in, and you can see it's trying to help me by adding some functions, but I don't want those, so I can press escape and then just finish typing my no and press escape again, and then press tab to finish typing the no. So what I've done here is I've said that I'm looking for records where invoice paid is no. That means they haven't paid yet. And we're going to hide this box as well. We don't need to see that the invoice paid field in our results. And we'll go ahead and save this query as unpaid invoice late fee, because we're going to actually calculate a late fee for these unpaid invoices. And so to do a calculation, we're going to use an empty column that hasn't been used yet. So I'll click in the field box to the right of invoice amount. And then I could just type it all in here. Let me scroll to the right just a little bit. I could type in here. I can expand this column width as needed so that I can type everything. Or what's usually preferred is we go up to the Query Tools Design ribbon and click Builder, and it brings up the Expression Builder with more help for us. So in the Expression Builder, we want to look in this middle panel of expression categories. This is where we find all the fields that are currently in our query. And we're going to calculate a late fee by taking the invoice amount. So I double-clicked invoice amount, it put it up in my expression area, and then I want to use an asterisk for multiply, and I want to type 0.02. So I want to take my invoice amount times 0.02 or 2%, and that's going to calculate my late fee for me. So then I can click OK, and it puts that calculation down in the field box for my new column. But by default, it gives the field a name of EXPR1 and then a colon. So I want to change that field name by deleting the EXPR1 but keeping the colon, and then we're going to type the name late fee, no spaces, and that just sets the name for the column. But we also want to change a couple of the properties associated with this column, and so we have to bring up the property sheet. That's up in our Query Tools Design ribbon. We click Property Sheet, and it puts the property sheet on the right. And so be sure that you are still clicked inside the late fee area or the property sheet might apply to something different. For example, if I click in this middle part, all the properties change. So I want to be sure I'm clicked in this late fee calculation, so I'll be changing the properties for that. And in the property sheet, we want to change first the caption. So it says caption, we click in the right side of the table, and the caption is going to be, of course, late fee with a space. And then we can close that property sheet and run our query. And we see late fee at the top, and we see all of the calculations. But it's not formatted as money yet. And so we do need to go back to the data design view, and we're going to click somewhere in this late fee calculation, bring up the property sheet again, and to make it look like money, we'll change the format. So we'll click to the right side of format, use the drop-down box and choose currency, and then we can close that property sheet and run our query again and see the money. So let's save this query and close it. And now we're going to look at a couple of different ways that Access handles aggregate data. So aggregate amounts typically refer to where we're getting a total amount over several records or even all the records in a database. And so one way we're going to see by opening the billing table, and on the home ribbon there is a totals button. So if I click that totals button, all it did is bring up a totals row for this particular table. And so on this row, I can click under any column and apply some kind of a statistical function to that column. So what we want to do here is maybe I just want to see the total of my invoice amounts. So I click in this invoice amount column. I have a drop-down box, and you can see the different functions you can choose. I'm just going to choose sum, and it's giving me quickly the total of all of my invoices. If I want to remove that totals row, I can just click the totals button again up in the ribbon, and it remove the totals row. So we're going to close this table and not save it. Say no to save it. And so that's just one way of getting some quick numbers from your data. But if you want to be able to do more sophisticated calculations, you have to create a query. So we will create query design. We're just going to query the billing table. So we'll add that and close, resize as needed. And then for this query, we're going to add 3 different amounts based on invoice amount. We're going to get the minimum invoice amount, the maximum invoice amount, and the average invoice amount. So we're going to double click invoice amount to add it 3 times. So double click it 3 times. So we'll have 3 columns that all say invoice amount to begin with. But then in our Query Tools Design ribbon, we'll use this totals button to bring up a total row in our query design. And by default, it uses this group by operator, but we need to click in there where it says group by and change each one to a different function. So the first one is going to be min, so that's going to calculate the minimum invoice amount. The second one is going to be average, and the third one is going to be max. Now I can run this right now. It doesn't tell us to in the book, but I want you to see. So I've run it, and it's giving me the minimum invoice amount is $15, the average is $108.94, and the maximum is $350. But look what it's doing to these column headings. It's just creating a generic name of max of or average of, min of. And so we are going to change the captions and names for these calculated fields. So we'll go back to design view. Now to give each one of these a name, we have to click in the field box before the field name that's there and type a new field name for it followed by a colon. So for this first one, we're going to type out the whole word minimum invoice amount, AMT, and then a colon and then a space. And I'm going to expand the width of this column so I can see what I'm doing. So you should have minimum invoice amount, colon, space, and then invoice amount again, because that's the actual field name that we're using. We're going to do that for each of these fields. I'm just going to make each one of mine wide so I can see what I'm doing. Whoops. And so the name for the middle one should be average invoice amount. And then the name for the third one should be maximum invoice amount. So now they have better names, but we also want to give each one of them a caption with real words with spaces in it. So we'll go back to the first column, just click somewhere in that field box for the first column, click property sheet, and for that first column we want the caption to be minimum invoice AMT with spaces between the words. Then we'll click on the second column for average, click in caption, and make that average invoice amount with spaces. And then the third one should be maximum invoice amount with spaces. And so you can go back and check each one, make sure that they are entered correctly. And we can close the property sheet. We can run our query again. And we can click the table or the datasheet selector and double click a column so that we can see the captions that we've added for each column. We want to go ahead and save this query as invoice amount statistics, no spaces, and abbreviate amount. So we save our query. And then we're going to make a slightly different version of this same query. So we'll go back to Design View, and we're going to save this query under a different name. So we'll go to File, Save As. This time it is an object, not the whole database. So we're going to choose Save this object as, Save Object As, include, and click Save As. And then we want name to be, we'll get rid of copy of, the name to be invoice amount statistics, and we'll add by walk-in at the end. And it is a query, so then we'll click OK. So it made a copy of what we did before. Now, we could have also closed it and used copy and paste like we did before, but this is just another method. We can keep it open and save it under a different name. So now the only change I want to make is, instead of seeing the minimum, average, and max for all of my patients, I want to see the minimum, average, and max for the walk-ins versus the non-walk-ins. So I want to group it by walk-in, whether they're a walk-in or not. That's going to require another table because the walk-in field is not part of the billing table. So I'll use the Show Table button at the top and add my visit table, and then close. And so from my visit table, that has the walk-in field. I want to add it to be the first column in my query so that I can group by walk-in. So to make it the first column, all I have to do is drag it and drop it in that first column, and it'll shift everything over. So I'll take it, drag it, drop it. It shifts the other columns over. It leaves walk-in as my first column, and group by on the total row is the default. So it's going to group the data by walk-in. So we'll run it, and you can see the difference. Here, yes, here are the walk-ins, and there's their minimum, average, and maximum amounts. And then the non-walk-ins have apparently a smaller minimum, average, and maximum amounts. So we'll save this query and close it. And then the only other thing we're going to look at quickly is this navigation pane. I'm going to make mine a little bigger. We could have been closing it and opening it frequently throughout our work today. It does give you more workspace if it's closed, or you can leave it open. And then you have an arrow at the top for all access objects, or you can choose to different ways of viewing the data that's here in the navigation pane. Right now it's looking at all access objects by object type, or I could choose tables and related views, and you can see how it's showing me the visit table and all the queries related to the visit table, the patient table and all of its queries, etc. I'm going to go back to this all tables arrow now and choose just the patient table. So if I'm just working with patients for a while, I can hide everything else that's in this navigation pane and just concentrate on patients. Now I'm going to go back to the patient arrow and click object type again, and that brings me back to the default. So we are through with this project. We simply need to go to File and Compact and Repair, and then you can submit.